The iron taste of fear was always the first thing Silas recognized upon waking, even before the sun had begun to bleach the eastern sky above the hills of Galilee. It was not the sudden shock of danger, but the slow, corrosive acid of anticipation. Every morning for the past 7 years, he had been trapped in the same waking nightmare, a tightening vice around his sternum that medicine men called indigestion or bile, but which Silas knew was the sheer, crushing weight of all future possibilities pressing down upon the present moment. He owned the largest, most successful olive press operation outside Capernaum. His stores were overflowing, his oil was renowned for its purity, and he employed dozens of men. By any measure of the world, he was blessed. Yet, he lived perpetually on the edge of catastrophe. Tonight, the bandits might come. Next month, the drought might wither the ancient trees. Next year, the Romans might impose a levy so steep it would wipe out his entire estate, leaving his wife Leah and his 4 children destitute, thrown onto the mercy of neighbors. This morning, the anxiety was a roaring furnace. He lay rigid on his sleeping mat, the sweat cooling on his brow, listening to the rhythmic, comforting breathing of Leah beside him, a peace he could no longer access. The stillness of the early hour was not restful. It was a vast, empty canvas waiting to be filled with disaster scenarios, which his mind diligently supplied, one vivid, terrifying image after another. He saw the fire licking at his oil vats, the market collapsing beneath the weight of grain tariffs, the faces of his children turning away from him in famine. He calculated the yield of the upcoming harvest, then immediately recalculated the anticipated failure rate based on the preceding year's erratic rainfall. Deducting the expected bribes he would have to pay the local tax collectors, and mentally subtracted the cost of grain needed to sustain his workers through the slow season. The math never brought comfort. It only illuminated the thin, brittle thread on which his entire existence and the existence of 50 other souls seemed to hang. He felt the insidious grip of control, the belief that if he worried enough, if he planned enough, if he cataloged every potential failure, he could somehow negate its power. But instead of providing safety, this relentless mental accounting had built a magnificent gilded cage around his soul. His hands, usually steady and strong from working the press, trembled visibly when he tried to lift the small clay cup to drink water. He was a prisoner of the days that had not yet arrived, sacrificing the reality of this beautiful dawn for the phantom threats lurking in the distant future. He swung his legs off the mat, the soft earth cool beneath his feet, and moved toward the window, desperately seeking a distraction from the relentless internal tremor that made sleep an impossibility and wakefulness a torture. He saw the first sliver of sun touch the eastern ridges, promising a day of warmth and labor, yet all he felt was the deepening chill of his own profound, unshakable fear. The roots of Silas's paralyzing apprehension were anchored deeply in a tragedy that had struck their village almost a decade prior, a time before his current wealth. He had been a young man, fiercely ambitious but poor, when a sudden, unexpected plague swept through the region, taking his parents in the space of 3 miserable days. The shock wasn't just the grief, it was the realization of utter, brutal randomness. They had been strong, faithful people, yet they were swept away by something utterly beyond their control, a microscopic cruelty delivered on the wind. That loss shattered his youthful trust in the inherent goodness or stability of the universe. He had vowed then, standing over the freshly turned earth of their graves, that he would never again be caught defenseless by chance. He would build walls around his life, not of stone, but of foresight and resource. He would become indispensable, successful, and financially impregnable, believing that wealth and detailed preparation were the only true shields against the chaos of fate. This vow had fueled his rise. He worked 15 hours a day, neglecting meals and rest, acquiring fields, perfecting his pressing techniques, bargaining ruthlessly, and reinvesting every shekel. He became known as Silas the Measured, a title he wore with grim pride. He managed to purchase the best tracts of olive groves, anticipating the slight shift in rainfall patterns better than his competitors. He built stone reservoirs, hedging against drought. He hired guards, securing his property against theft. He controlled every variable that the mortal mind could conceive of controlling. But the deeper he drove his roots into the ground of control, the higher his internal structure of anxiety grew. His life became a perpetual state of readiness for the worst-case scenario. When the harvest was good, he worried about storage. When the political landscape stabilized, he worried about the inevitable revolution. When Leah gave birth to a healthy child, he worried incessantly about the child's first fever. He didn't live life, he managed risk. The irony was that the very success he had achieved to quell his fear became the fear itself. The higher the structure, the more terrifying the potential fall. He could remember vividly an evening just last week, sitting down to a rich meal prepared by Leah, when a sudden sharp pain flared in his abdomen. Immediate panic. Was this the sickness that took his parents? Was this the end? He pushed the food away, spending the next 3 hours examining his skin for blemishes, measuring his pulse, completely missing the laughter of his children playing near the hearth. Leah, noticing his constant state of alertness, his eyes always scanning the horizon, his hands fiddling with small calculations carved onto wax tablets, had begun to look at him with pity that cut deeper than any insult. She knew his wealth was his fortress, but she knew it was his cage, confining him far more ruthlessly than any Roman jailer. He craved the freedom of the birds he saw circling lazily above his groves, creatures who seemed to possess no storehouses, yet who woke each day without this cold, relentless dread. The decision to seek out the teacher, this rabbi from Nazareth called Yeshua, was born not of faith, but of ultimate, crushing failure in his own system of control. Silas had exhausted every known remedy. He had paid enormous sums to priests to offer sacrifices for protection. He had worn amulets blessed by wandering mystics. He had consulted physicians who prescribed bitter herbs and rigorous fasts, believing his affliction was merely humoral imbalance. None of it touched the core of the problem. The pain in his chest, the tremor in his hands, the insomnia, these were mere symptoms of the spiritual malady, the soul's exhaustion from trying to carry tomorrow's burden today. He heard rumors filtering into Capernaum of this man who didn't just heal the body, but who seemed to soothe the very spirit. People spoke of lepers cleansed and blind eyes opened, yes, but more strangely, they spoke of an inexplicable peace that settled upon those who merely listened to him speak. Silas, the man who trusted only observable, quantifiable metrics, found himself clinging to a desperate, unquantifiable hope. It felt shameful, like admitting defeat. He was the successful man, the one who solved problems. Seeking out a traveling preacher for an invisible ailment felt utterly ridiculous. Yet the alternative was a life spent in perpetual dread until the dread itself finally claimed him. He told Leah he was traveling south on business, needing to secure a new market for his oil in Tiberias. In reality, he set his donkey east, toward the vast empty plains and the rolling hills where the teacher was rumored to be gathering immense crowds. The journey was agonizing. Every turn of the road brought a fresh spike of panic. What if he was robbed? What if his manager betrayed him while he was gone? What if this Yeshua was a charlatan and Silas had wasted precious time and energy on a fool's errand? The physical distance from his ledgers and his stores did not loosen the grip of his worries. It merely forced him to carry them internally, without the comforting distraction of work. He noted every cloud formation, judging potential rain and potential travel delays. He scrutinized every face on the road, assessing the probability of danger. He arrived near the destination, a gently sloping hillside near the edge of the lake, feeling more frayed and exhausted than when he had left his post. The sheer volume of people shocked him, thousands upon thousands, spilling across the green slopes like a scattered flock, unified by a desperate thirst. They were the hungry, the sick, the outcast, and the simply curious. Silas, the man who trusted only observable, quantifiable metrics, found himself clinging to a desperate, unquantifiable hope. It felt shameful, like admitting defeat. He was the successful man, the one who solved problems. Seeking out a traveling preacher for an invisible ailment felt utterly ridiculous. Yet the alternative was a life spent in perpetual dread until the dread itself finally claimed him.
The sheer, chaotic energy of the gathered multitude was nearly enough to send Silas retreating instantly. He was a man of order, of quiet efficiency. This mass of humanity buzzing with expectation, children crying, merchants hawking water, the sharp smell of sweat and dust rising in the heat, it was overwhelming. He found a spot far up the slope, leaning against a stunted olive tree, trying to remain invisible, trying to absorb the atmosphere without being swallowed by it. He watched the procession as the teacher, Yeshua, and his small band of followers ascended a natural prominence on the hillside. From his distance, the teacher was merely a figure of light, distinct only because of the attention fixed upon him. Silas squinted, trying to discern the aura of power, the trickery or the greatness that drew such disparate people. He saw no elaborate vestments, no royal trappings, just a man of humble cloth, his posture relaxed, his face etched with an unwavering calm that seemed to defy the tumult surrounding him. And then Yeshua began to speak. His voice, though not loud in the sense of a shouting orator, carried an astonishing resonance. It didn't pierce the air. It seemed to settle into the heart. The surrounding noise of the crowd, which had been a low, persistent roar of nervous energy, began to diminish, subsumed by the rhythm of his words. Silas was not a religious man in the devoted sense, but he was forced to admit that this man spoke with an authority unlike the scribes or Pharisees he had heard in the synagogues. They quoted the past. This man spoke the present truth as if he had just discovered it. He began with blessings that seemed utterly counterintuitive to Silas's worldview. Blessings upon the poor in spirit,
the mourners, the meek. Silas, who valued strength, self-sufficiency, and aggressive planning, felt a profound, cold cynicism rise in his throat. Blessings for the meek! The meek inherit nothing but dust and debt. Yet, as the teacher continued, speaking of radical ethics, love your enemy, turn the other cheek, Silas realized he was not describing a legal code. He was describing an internal freedom that sprang from complete surrender of the need for vengeance or control over the actions of others. It was unsettling. It felt like watching a master craftsman dismantling the very foundation of the world Silas had painstakingly built. The air grew thick with unspoken understanding, a sense that every person there, regardless of their ailment or despair, was being seen not merely for their outward appearance, but for the profound, frightened reality of their hidden soul. Silas felt his defenses beginning to soften, not because of belief, but because the sheer, unblinking honesty of the man's gaze, even from that distance, seemed to expose the brittle nature of Silas's own frantic efforts to shield himself from the world's harshness. He listened, not searching for a miracle to cure his trembling hands, but searching for a logical flaw in this radical philosophy that promised peace through utter vulnerability. He needed to prove it wrong, to defend his fortress of control. But the soothing, relentless logic of the teacher's words was already eroding the outer walls.
The sun climbed higher, relentless in its intensity, but the crowd remained riveted. Yeshua shifted the focus of his teaching, moving from the laws of righteousness to the heart of human motivation, the crippling tendency to prioritize the fleeting over the eternal. He spoke of prayer, of genuine connection versus outward show, and then he moved into the domain that governed every waking moment of Silas's life: wealth and provision. He spoke of laying up treasures not on earth, where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in, but in heaven. This passage hit Silas with the sharpness of a stone thrown directly at his chest. His entire life had been defined by the pursuit of earthly security. He had sacrificed his peace, his health, and his relationships entirely for the sake of accumulating stores that could indeed be destroyed by a single pestilence or a careless Roman administrator. Yeshua's voice, calm but utterly penetrating, cut through Silas's self-justifications. He spoke of the eye being the lamp of the body, and how a focus on material anxieties darkens the whole soul, blinding the person to what truly matters. And then came the profound, unavoidable question, the one that exposed the fundamental flaw in Silas's system of worry. Yeshua asked, "Which of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life?" It was not a rhetorical question, it was a devastating indictment of the futility of anxiety. Silas, who spent countless hours rehearsing catastrophic outcomes in his mind, had to confront the cold, hard truth. His worry had never prevented a single disaster. It had only stolen the joy and health of the present moment. He realized with a sudden, sickening clarity that his anxiety wasn't prudence. It was a profound act of self-idolatry, the belief that his mental effort was more potent than the forces governing the universe, or more tragically, that he had to personally manage a world abandoned by its creator. His fear was, in its essence, a lack of trust in provision itself. The teacher then began to paint a picture of perfect, effortless sufficiency, an image that stood in stark contrast to Silas's sweat-drenched vigilance. He told the gathered people to look up, to see the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, yet their heavenly Father feeds them. He asked, Are you not of more value than they?" Silas felt the heat of shame rising in his neck. He who carefully measured every shekel and every drop of oil was being compared unfavorably to the unconcerned sparrow. This wasn't merely a spiritual lesson, it was a direct challenge to the logic and pride that had sustained his success. The core message was that excessive worry is not an expression of care, but a fundamental failure of perspective, a blindness to the abundance already present. It was at this moment, feeling the full burning weight of his personal inadequacy against this divine logic, that I must pause and ask you, the viewer, about your own struggle. We live in a world that glorifies vigilance and constant planning, telling us that resting is weakness. Have you ever realized that your deepest anxiety isn't about solving a problem, but about needing to maintain absolute, crushing control over every single variable in your life? When does planning end and destructive, soul-consuming worry begin? Share your perspective in the comments below, because often the first step toward healing is simply naming the prison we've built for ourselves.
The teacher's voice continued, drifting down the slope, drawing Silas back into the current of the address. After using the example of the birds, Yeshua turned his gaze, scanning the vast audience, and then presented the second, even more profound image of unburdened existence, the lilies of the field. These flowers, he explained, neither toil nor spin, yet Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Silas pictured the opulent, carefully woven robes of the elite priests and merchants he dealt with in Jerusalem, robes bought with anxiety, sold with calculation, and worn with the burden of expectation. Yet the teacher claimed that the simple, uncultivated wildflowers, which would be cut down and burned tomorrow, possessed a momentary, perfect beauty that surpassed all human striving. The point was inescapable. If God so clothes the grass of the field, which exists only for a season, how much more will he clothe and care for you, O you of little faith? This phrase, O you of little faith, was the final blow to Silas's fortress. It wasn't an accusation hurled in anger, but a gentle, sorrowful diagnosis. Silas realized his anxiety wasn't simply a personality quirk or an occupational hazard. It was the active denial of the presence of a loving, providing Creator. Every hour he spent worrying about the bandit attack that might happen, the crop failure that might come, or the debt that might accrue, was an hour spent doubting the essential goodness and order of the universe. It was assuming that if he didn't personally calculate and manage every disaster, chaos would consume everything. He had been taught since childhood that God sustained the world, yet his daily actions declared that Silas sustained his own small corner of it alone, fearful and exhausted. His mind, trained for decades in the sharp edges of calculation, tried to revolt. But Jesus, what about responsibility? What about prudence? We cannot simply sit in the field and wait for oil to flow. The immediate answer, embedded in the spirit of the teaching, was that diligent work is necessary, but panicked worry is not. Work is an act of creation. Worry is an act of destruction. Work engages the present. Worry pollutes the future. The crucial distinction was the motivation behind the action. Was Silas working out of a joyful response to provision, or out of a desperate, panicked attempt to avert certain, impending doom? Clearly it was the latter. He felt a deep, wrenching pain, not the physical pain in his chest, which oddly seemed to be receding slightly in the face of this profound realization, but the spiritual agony of recognizing the utter waste of his last 7 years, years spent forfeiting happiness for an illusion of security.
He watched a young mother near the front, balancing an infant on her hip, her face alight with an expression of hope and comprehension. She had nothing, perhaps, but she possessed a peace that Silas, with his overflowing barns, had never tasted. He began to weep silently, the tears carving clean trails through the dust on his cheeks, tears not of sorrow, but of the dawning recognition of a lifelong mistake.
The intellectual struggle transitioned into profound personal confrontation. Silas, leaning heavily against the tree, felt the weight of his entire meticulously planned life crashing down. He had prided himself on being a practical man, a realist. He saw the world as inherently dangerous, and his survival depended on his own wits. But Yeshua's words redefined realism. True realism, according to this rabbi, was recognizing that the world is sustained by a force far greater than a merchant's ledger. The anxiety that gripped him, that constant low-level hum of dread, was revealed not as a necessary shield, but as the primary obstacle to his well-being. He was constantly anticipating failure, but in doing so, he was ensuring the failure of his own spirit to flourish in the present moment. He remembered the numerous sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, worrying about the integrity of his irrigation channels, only to wake up and find the channels perfectly intact, but his body broken by exhaustion. He had traded sleep for an hour of hypothetical problem-solving that yielded no tangible results, yet cost him his peace. This particular teaching, the one about the futility of adding a single cubit to life, was the key that unlocked his prison door. His greatest fear was death or ruin or the sickness of his family. Yet all his worry did was hasten his internal decay and make his current life miserable. If he could not prevent the ultimate calamities by worrying, why bother indulging in the mental torture? He realized his control was an illusion. The only thing he actually controlled was his own reaction to the events of the day. And his reaction, for years, had been fear. The teacher then brought the lesson to its immediate practical conclusion, the final instruction for escaping the cycle of crippling anxiety. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. This statement was revolutionary to Silas. It was not a call to irresponsibility, but a radical call to presence. Focus on today. Solve today's problems. Work today's fields. Appreciate today's bounty. Tomorrow is a construct of the mind, and burdening today with the unknown weights of the future is spiritual suicide. Silas had lived his life entirely in a future tense. I will be happy when the debt is paid. I will rest when the harvest is in. I will stop worrying when the Romans leave. But tomorrow never arrived. Only an endless succession of todays, burdened by the anxieties manufactured yesterday. A sudden, deep breath shuddered through Silas's chest, the first genuinely deep breath he had taken in months. It was a physical response to a spiritual truth that had finally penetrated the defensive armor of his intellect. The lesson wasn't about ignoring tomorrow, it was about honoring today. Understanding that sufficient grace and provision exist only in the present moment. Worrying about tomorrow was drawing an overdraft on grace that hadn't yet been issued. The physical change began subtly, then accelerated dramatically. As Silas processed the liberating realization that his worry was useless, an internal muscle, held rigid for years, finally relaxed. The tightness that had been a persistent resident in his sternum, the sensation of an unliftable stone pressing down,
began to dissolve. It was not a sudden burst of lightning or a theatrical command from the teacher. It was the quiet cessation of internal war. The pain left not because a foreign element was removed, but because Silas finally ceased struggling against the reality of his own limitation. He recognized that his anxiety was not a defense mechanism, but a self-inflicted wound. And the moment he mentally dropped the heavy burden of managing the entire future, his body responded instantly. His hands, which had been involuntarily clenching the rough bark of the olive tree, softened, the tremor diminishing until they lay open, resting on his knees. He felt a wave of dizziness, the disorientation of a man stepping out of a suffocating atmosphere and into clean air. He was suddenly aware of the simple physical reality of the moment, the scent of sun-baked earth and wild thyme, the distant lapping of the water of the lake, the warmth on his skin. These were sensations he hadn't truly registered in years, because his mind was always elsewhere, in the hypothetical future, defending against phantom threats. His focus sharpened on the mundane, beautiful reality of the present. He saw the intricate patterns on the leaves of the tree above him, noticed the varied colors in the robes of the people nearby, and registered the genuine, profound stillness of the teacher, who stood silent now, letting his final, powerful words settle over the masses. Silas felt a flush of warmth spread through his entire body, washing away the coldness that had been his constant companion. He realized that the greatest miracle was not the healing of a wound caused by another, but the healing of a wound caused by himself. He hadn't needed medicine or an exorcism. He needed a radical shift in perspective. He stood up slowly, testing his balance. The heavy dread that used to pull his shoulders forward was gone, replaced by a light, unfamiliar buoyancy. He was still Silas, the oil merchant, with 1,000 real problems awaiting him in Capernaum. Accounts to settle, workers to manage, Roman taxes to navigate. But he was also Silas, the man who knew that today's strength was sufficient for today's demands. He no longer needed to carry the potential tragedy of next year into this afternoon. He felt the overwhelming desire to laugh, a deep cleansing sound that surprised even himself, followed quickly by an even stronger desire to simply rest, to be present, and to stop running the marathon of fear he had been unknowingly running for a decade. He looked at the teacher, who was now beginning to descend the hill, and though their eyes never met, Silas felt a connection of understanding, a quiet recognition that the true healing had taken place at the level of the soul's foundation.
The journey back to Capernaum was unlike any journey Silas had ever taken. The road, which had been fraught with imagined dangers on the way out, was now just a road, dusty, familiar, lined with scrub brush and small stones. He didn't scrutinize every passing traveler. He simply greeted them. He didn't worry about the stability of his donkey's saddle. He trusted the craftsmanship. The political tension in the air, the omnipresent shadow of the Roman occupation, which had previously felt like a personal threat, now seemed simply a distant reality, something to be addressed when it arrived, not something to be feared in advance. He practiced the lesson immediately. A thought would spring up, demanding his attention. What if the new shipment of press stones arrives cracked? Before the thought could trigger the usual cascade of panic and mental planning for replacement, Silas would gently, firmly interject the teacher's words.
Today has enough trouble of its own. He would refocus on the immediate task, guiding the donkey, finding a good camping spot for the evening, enjoying the taste of the bread he ate. The sheer relief of dropping the baggage of the future was intoxicating. He arrived back at his estate 2 days later, not exhausted and trembling, but alert and surprisingly energetic. Leah met him at the gate, her brow furrowed with the habitual worry his presence usually inspired. She looked him over, searching for the telltale signs of strain, the dark circles under his eyes, the tightness around his mouth. She found none of the familiar landscape of anxiety. Instead, she found a stillness in his eyes she hadn't seen since they were children. He smiled, a genuine, unforced expression that reached his eyes and embraced her tightly, holding her not with the panicked grip of a man clinging to something he might lose, but with the warm assurance of a man grateful for what he possessed right now. His manager, Boaz, immediately launched into a worried report about a minor fluctuation in the price of imported grain, anticipating Silas's usual furious response and immediate complicated counter-strategy. Silas listened calmly, assessed the situation, and simply gave Boaz a measured instruction to hold the current stock and wait until the next market day. "We cannot control the price of grain, Boaz," Silas said, leaning back in his chair, a profound sense of ease radiating from him. "We can only control our response today. Let us focus on the quality of the oil we press today." Boaz stared, bewildered. This was a man utterly changed. The immediate shift was in Silas's decision-making. He was no less diligent, but he was far more decisive because he was no longer paralyzed by the infinite branches of potential future failure. He accepted the limits of his control and worked only within the sphere of his influence, leaving the rest, the truly unmanageable future, to the hands of Providence. He slept that night the sleep of the profoundly weary and the newly free. He woke before dawn, as usual, but this time the iron taste of fear was absent. There was only the quiet awareness of the dawn and the simple, astonishing realization that today was enough. The transformation of Silas was not a single event, but a daily, conscious choice, a relentless practice of the forgotten lesson. The temptation to revert to the old habits of catastrophic thinking was strong. Every business setback, every delay in shipping, every minor fever in one of his children would act like a siren call, beckoning him back into the familiar yet destructive fortress of worry. But he had tasted true peace, and that memory was a more powerful motivation than any profit or loss. He began to see his work differently. His olive press operation, once a source of unending anxiety, became an opportunity for mindful diligence. He still planned, but his planning was now strategic and limited, focusing on efficiency and quality rather than defensive hoarding against a phantom recession. He learned to delegate, realizing that his attempt to oversee every single variable was not a mark of excellence, but a mark of deep-seated fear and a lack of trust in his employees. As he loosened his grip, his workers felt more respected, and ironically, the operation became smoother and more profitable. But the greatest difference was at home. He spent genuine, undistracted time with Leah and the children. He stopped calculating future college funds while listening to their stories. He stopped fearing the onset of winter while enjoying the warmth of the summer sun. He learned the radical simplicity of living in the now, realizing that this now was the only moment he truly possessed, and that polluting it with the fears of the non-existent future was the ultimate act of self-harm. He often found himself looking at the marketplace, seeing other merchants, men just like he was, their faces etched with the same lines of strain, their bodies stiff with unacknowledged tension. He recognized the look, the internal war, the constant carrying of burdens not meant for their shoulders. He wanted to shout the lesson from the rooftops, "Look at the lilies! Stop trying to sustain the world." But he knew the lesson had to be discovered individually through the painful exhaustion of self-reliance. He understood that the teacher had not offered a magical antidote. He had offered a fundamental, structural truth about the human condition and its relationship to the divine. Worry is a form of temporal displacement, and the cure is radical presence, anchored in trust. Silas continued his life as a wealthy merchant, but his relationship with his wealth changed entirely. It was no longer a shield against chaos. It was a resource to manage with gratitude and diligence. He started giving generously, without the fear that this act of kindness would bankrupt him tomorrow. He understood that true security was not found in the size of his storehouses, but in the sufficiency of the provider, which was promised anew with the rising of every sun. The fear was replaced by a deep, quiet gratitude, a realization that the pain he suffered was entirely of his own making, and the freedom he received was a gift, accessed only by the humbling act of relinquishing control to something infinitely wiser than himself. The forgotten lesson wasn't about being careless, it was about being cared for, trusting in the divine economy that clothed the fields and fed the birds, and recognizing that humanity was valued far above them all. It was the simple mathematics of grace that healed his heart and calmed his anxious racing mind, proving that peace was indeed possible, even in a chaotic world ruled by Caesar and fraught with natural uncertainty. His body, once tormented by the physical manifestations of his internal struggle, grew steady and strong, a testament to the fact that healing the mind often heals the rest of the man as well. He was learning to live one day at a time, finding in that simplicity an unimaginable strength and an abiding, unshakable joy.